Well, hello everyone. It's good to be back, and I'm so glad to see everyone here again for this session of the Pari Center's online summer series, exploring the life and work of David Bohm. For people who don't know me, I'm James G. Barbieri, a member of Board of Directors of the Pari Center, and I will be your host today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peat, Director of the Pari Center, and Maureen Doolan, co-founder of the Pari Center, who will basically ensure that everything runs smoothly. Before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphones, just to ensure a better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we can hear some weird background noise, but this is not to silence a participant's voice. It's just to ensure a overall good audio quality. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion, they can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which should show up near the chat. Otherwise, just physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, I'll give you your voice, and then just turn on your microphone and make your contribution. We also invite all speakers to turn on their video camera, as we believe that seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice, inclusive educational environment. As I mentioned earlier, all sessions will be recorded for archival purposes. The recordings will not include the possible breakout room discussions, but we will record the speakers' presentations, follow-up discussions, and Q&A. The recordings are available to anyone who has purchased a ticket for this session or for a session they have paid but were unable to attend. Now, today's session will be structured a little bit different from the others. We will have basically a longer presentation divided in 3 parts from our speaker, David Moody. And between each part, we will have the opportunity to ask questions and participate to the conversation. Now, I'll just introduce our speaker for today, David Edmund Moody. Today, the Pari Center extends a warm welcome to David Moody. David worked closely with David Bohm and Krishnamurti in his capacity as director of the Oak Grove School, founded by Krishnamurti in Ojai, California. David is also a writer and author of the book An Uncommon Collaboration, David Bohm and J. Krishnamurti and the Unconditioned Mind, J. Krishnamurti at the Oak Grove School. He is currently completing a biography of Krishnamurti that presents his philosophy in a new light. The book is entitled Krishnamurti in America, New Perspectives of the Man and His Message, which was scheduled for publication in October 2019. Today, he will be addressing the topic Insight and Illusion in Bohmian Psychology. So now enough about me, over to you, David.
Okay, thank you, James. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, wow, quite a good group. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to James for the nice introduction. And thanks to Eleanor for inviting me to participate. It's a little bit, intimidating to be included with so many very eminent other participants in this summer program, and actually it was especially intimidating because Eleanor told me at the beginning that I was going to have 2 hours to present, and I thought, yikes, how can I possibly fill up 2 hours? I've given a few talks before, but they're usually half an hour or 45 minutes or maybe an hour at the most. But then I started preparing and gathering material, and as the days went by, I realized I had more and more material. So after a few days, I was thinking, wait, but 2 hours is not enough. And the reason for that is because there's so many, interesting things that Bohm said. He had so many interesting insights and observations to share with you. You know, when Paul Howard interviewed me for the film, I made the point that, you know, not all geniuses are the same. There's different kinds of genius. And, you know, one kind is what you might think of as sort of a singular, unitary kind of genius like Picasso or Mozart, who had incredible talent in a particular area. But there's another kind that I would call a universal genius, like Aristotle or Leonardo da Vinci, people whose genius is made manifest and expresses itself no matter what field they address themselves to. And that's the kind of genius Bohm was. He was a universal genius. His genius showed up whether he was addressing himself to mathematics or quantum theory or cosmology with his idea of the implicate order, or, as I hope to show you today, also in the field of human psychology. So the title of my talk today is Insight and Illusion in Bohmian Psychology. So I'm going to try to start sharing my screen now so you can see some of my slides, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so let's see here. Okay. So is that good? Can you all see that properly? Is that good, James? Okay, good. So anyway, I was asked to talk about Bohm's involvement with Krishnamurti's philosophy, and I'm going to try to include that, but you can't really understand Bohm's involvement with Krishnamurti unless you kind of widen the scope and look at Bohm's relationship to the field of psychology as a whole. And after I settled on a topic for my talk and started to prepare it, I decided to include a subtitle, which is the Undiscovered Continent of David Bohm's worldview. And to understand that subtitle, you have to remember that, you know, Bohm is known primarily for his contributions in quantum theory and cosmology. And some of his contributions in physics, you know, seem to have implications for consciousness, because Bohm had the idea that even matter itself at its most fundamental, subtle level has a very subtle kind of mind-like quality. And some of Bohm's ideas about cosmology also have seem to have spiritual implications. And, you know, I think that Paul Howard's film brought out that aspect very well. And but there's also something ironic about this aspect of Bohm's work, because people who are interested in Bohm's physics and they're aware that there's some connection between the physics and consciousness, you know, they think that's it. But Bohm's had physics which had implications for consciousness. But even those people who are aware of those wider implications may not realize that Bohm also had a tremendous quantity of insights and observations about human consciousness, about the field of human psychology. And that's really not very well known, and that's why I call that the undiscovered continent of David Bohm's worldview. And that's what I'll try to bring out for you today. So my presentation will be in three parts. The first part is going to be biographical, and I'll try to review the whole course of Bohm's interest in the psychological field. And then we'll pause and take a few questions. And then the second part is the main part, where I'm going to try to condense and give you a brief overview of Bohm's the actual substance and content of his views in the field of psychology. And then we'll take a few more questions. And finally, in the third part, we'll talk about, you know, what's called Bohm dialogue, Bohm's original idea for dialogue, and how that's a natural extension of the totality of his views in the field of psychology. So we'll begin by reviewing Bohm's, the background of Bohm's interest in psychology. And, you know, one of the interesting points that came out in the film was when David Peat was talking about Bohm's ideas about plasma. You know, plasma is what they call the fourth state of matter. It's a little bit like a gas, but heated to very, very high temperatures. And when Bohm was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, he developed some ideas about the behavior of electrons in a plasma. And it was quite an important contribution. It's called Bohm diffusion. And you can go to Wikipedia and look up a whole article about Bohm diffusion. But the interesting point that David Peat made was that when Bohm developed this idea, he saw a relationship between the behavior of electrons in the plasma and human freedom. And I found that particularly interesting because it goes to show that even as a very, very young man, Bohm was interested in, you know, basic issues of human relationship and society. And this was an extension of his interest in Marxist theory, because it goes to show that he was interested in Marxism not just as an economic theory, but for what you know, Marxist ideology has to say about the conditions for human freedom, the relationship of the individual to society. So even as a young man, Bohm was already interested in understanding basic human relationships, not just you know, the study of matter and physics. Also, Basil highly pointed out in the film that part of the reason that Bohm attended a few meetings of the Communist Party when he was at Berkeley was because he wanted to find someone with whom he could discuss Hegel. And he couldn't find anybody, which is the reason he stopped going to those meetings. But Bohm's interest in Hegel continued for many years. Even after Berkeley, after his years at Princeton, after his years in Brazil, when he went to Israel and met his wife, Sarah, she mentioned that he was always walking around with a thick volume of a book by Hegel. And portions of Hegel's philosophy are very psychological. His, what most people consider his most important book is called The Phenomenology of Mind. And the subtitle of that book is The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. So that was also part of Bohm's interest in the field of psychology. And another reflection of Bohm's interest in psychology had to do with his response to the failure of the physics community to really appreciate his work in regarding hidden variables in quantum mechanics. And Bohm interpreted that failure to understand his work in very psychological terms. He made that clear in his book, Causality and Chance in Modern Physics, where he showed that the failure to understand and appreciate what he had shown was really a kind of psychological prejudice, a set of preconceived assumptions in the minds of the orthodox community of theoretical physicists. So this is some of the background to help you understand Bohm's interest in the field of psychology. And so Bohm met Krishnamurti when he was 43 years old in 1961. And, you know, the story of their meeting has been a little bit oversimplified. The story you often hear is that Bohm was in the library with his wife, Sarah, and she ran across this book that mentioned the observer and the observed. And right away, Bohm wanted to meet the author of that book, according to this story. But what really happened was a little bit more complicated. What happened was that Bohm took that book home and read the whole book. That book was called The First and Last Freedom. And it presents, a comprehensive overview of the whole of Krishnamurti's philosophy. And it does mention the observer and the observed, but the reason that Bohm wanted to meet Krishnamurti was because of the totality of his philosophy, not just that one connection with the observer and the observed. So many people in the physics community, and when Bohm was alive, and even people still today, have a hard time understanding why a scientist like David Bohm would get involved with someone like Krishnamurti. And I think the reason people find that puzzling is because they really have no understanding what Krishnamurti's philosophy is all about. And part of the reason for that, I feel that it's very unfortunate that Krishnamurti is so often referred to as an Indian philosopher. You heard that phrase used in the film, and you may have seen it in some of the publicity and in many, many other places. And I think it's unfortunate because it's true that Krishnamurti was born in India, but he left there at the age of 14, and after that he lived more in England and America than anywhere else. And from the age of 27 until he died at the age of 90, his primary home was in America, in California. And more fundamentally, Krishnamurti completely rejected, adamantly rejected any association with any nationality. That was really a crucial part of his philosophy. And in addition, he categorically, the roots of his philosophy were not in any Indian religion or Indian philosophy or Indian tradition. It was just original. So I realize I'm kind of swimming upstream when I try to say that people shouldn't refer to him as an Indian philosopher. People think, well, his name is Krishnamurti and he was born in India, so case closed, he must be an Indian philosopher. But I think that's really, it's a little bit insidious point of view because especially in the United States, that phrase might be appealing to some people, but for the large majority of people, at least in this country, it's not a very interesting or flattering thing to say to someone about someone. It kind of implies, okay, Indian philosopher, I know what that means, and I don't have to pay any more attention. So I think it serves as a block for people to understand what Krishnamurti is really all about. Because his philosophy is not about enlightenment or inspiration or Eastern mysticism or transcending everyday life. His philosophy is a comprehensive set of factual observations about everyday life and the actual states of mind and behavior and problems of ordinary people. It's about understanding our present consciousness, not escaping from it. He addressed topics like conflict, fear, ambition, violence, knowledge, nationalism, ambition, personal identity. And so there's nothing mysterious about Bohm's interest in Krishnamurti. It's a natural extension of his interest in society and individual freedom and the scientific quest for understanding and Hegelian philosophy. It really all fits together in a single coherent set of ideas. So I'm not going to talk that much about Krishnamurti today, but for people who are interested in his work and want to understand more about his life and his teachings, I would recommend this book, Krishnamurti in America, which I wrote and came out just a few months ago. This book is a complete biography of Krishnamurti. It emphasizes his life in America because the previous biographers did not have access to a great deal of information about his life in America. But this book also includes a review of all of his philosophy from the 1930s until the end of his life in 1986. So Bohm met Krishnamurti in 1961 after he read The First and Last Freedom, which is a comprehensive set of excerpts from Krishnamurti's public talks. And within a few years, Bohm was very engaged in exploring what Krishnamurti had to say. During those years, the 1960s, Krishnamurti used to give a series of public talks every summer in Switzerland. And so Bohm started traveling to Switzerland every summer to hear those talks. And then in 1969, Krishnamurti opened up the Brockwood Park School in England, about 70 miles south of London. And you may have noticed you saw a few pictures of Brockwood Park in the film, but you may not have realized that what it is a secondary school for boarding students. And so after the school opened, Bohm and his wife Sarah used to go down to Brockwood Park almost every weekend, whether Krishnamurti was there or not, in order to talk with the students and staff and talk over all the issues associated with how to adapt Krishnamurti's educational philosophy to a boarding school. This is a shot of Krishnamurti speaking to a group of students at Brockwood Park. So then the next major development in Bohm's interest in Krishnamurti's work occurred in 1975 when Krishnamurti started the Oak Grove School near his home in Ojai, California. So Ojai is a little town, a valley in Southern California. It's about 80 miles north of Los Angeles. And incidentally, that's where I'm speaking from today. And Oak Grove School is an elementary and secondary school. And today it has an enrollment of more than 200 students in kindergarten through 12th grade. So this is the first building that was constructed at Oak Grove. It won some architectural awards. The school now has, I think, about 8 buildings, but this was the first one. It's where we first started holding classes, and now it's used as kind of a multi-purpose room. So right from the very first year that the school opened, David and Sarah Bohm used to come out to Ojai from England and spend 5 or 6 weeks here every year. And I was the first teacher hired at Oak Grove School, and I can vividly recall the first time Bohm came out to visit us. There were about a dozen of us who were waiting for him in Krishnamurti's cottage, and there was kind of an electric atmosphere in the room in anticipation of his arrival, and you could tell that Krishnamurti was really looking forward to his coming. And then when Bohm arrived, you could see Krishnamurti greeted him very warmly, and you could see the mutual respect that passed between the two men. And anyway, they sat down and they started talking about the school, and Bohm said to Krishnamurti, do you think you can find any good teachers in Southern California? And I was a little bit embarrassed, but fortunately, Krishnamurti told him that they already had good teachers. And after that, David and Sarah came out to Ojai every year for about 6 weeks, usually between February and May, which was the period of the year when Krishnamurti was there. And they always stayed in the same apartment. It was upstairs over an office building about 50 yards away from Krishnamurti's cottage. and they stayed in that apartment so often that it eventually came to be known as the Bohm flat. And in the evenings, Bohm would often conduct meetings with the teachers and staff of the school and talk over all the problems and issues that came up. And he was very, very good in these meetings because he was friendly and relaxed and accessible. And yet at the same time, he was incredibly lucid and interesting in the way he addressed all of the questions that came up. I think that Bohm came out to Ojai every year that the school was open from 1975 until the year that Krishnamurti died, which was 1986. This is another one of the buildings, the secondary school building at Oak Grove. And so Bohm came, I was saying, Bohm came every year from 75 until 1985, which was right before Krishnamurti died. He died of pancreatic cancer in Ojai in February 1986. And after that, at first, it seemed like Bohm probably would not be coming to Ojai anymore, because the main purpose of his visits was really just to hang out and talk with Krishnamurti. And for many of us in Ojai, that was the prospect that he wouldn't come anymore was very regrettable. Bohm had formed a lot of close friendships with people in Ojai, and many people were very fond of him and had great admiration and respect for him. So a few of us formed a committee to see if we could arrange for some way for him to keep coming back, even in the absence of Krishnamurti himself. And so 4 of Bohm's friends, which were Michael Frederick, Joe Zorsky, Lee Nickel, and me, we formed what we called the Bohm Committee to see if we could get Bohm to come back. Michael Frederick and Joe Zorsky had been teachers at Brockwood Park who had moved to Ojai, and Lee Nickel at that time was a teacher in the Oak Grove School, and I was the director of the school at that time. And so we developed a proposal, which was that we would arrange for Bohm to conduct a weekend seminar, and we would sell tickets for people to attend the weekend seminar, and that way we would raise enough money to pay for the cost of the airfare for David and Cyril to fly out from England. And so we presented this idea to Bohm, and fortunately he agreed to give it a try. Now, it was understood from the beginning that these seminars were not, for the purpose of having Bohm discuss quantum theory or the implicate order or anything like that. You have to understand that people in the Krishnamurti world hardly even knew anything about Bohm's contribution in those fields. We knew, that he was a well-respected scientist, but to us, his main qualification was that he had conducted a very successful series of dialogues with Krishnamurti, because Krishnamurti used to speak with all kinds of people, individuals and small groups. And it was generally considered that out of all those people, Bohm was the best. He had the greatest insight into Krishnamurti's philosophy, and he was the most articulate, and obviously Krishnamurti held him in very high regard. And so that's who David Bohm was to us. He wasn't this maverick physicist who had written about hidden variables in quantum mechanics. And so it was understood without even having to discuss it that these weekend seminars would be for the purpose of discussing psychological issues, not physics or the implicate order or anything like that. Now, at that time, because I was director of the school, it was easy for me to make the facilities of the Oak Grove School available for the David Bohm seminars. So the first time we did this was December of 1986. David and Cyril came out to Ojai from England, and the Krishnamurti Foundation allowed them to stay in the Bohm flat as usual. And we cleared out a big space in the Oak Grove School library, and that is where we conducted these weekend seminars. So this is the secondary school, and this part of the school here is where the library is located, where we conducted the seminars. And this is what that library looks like before we moved all the furniture out of the way in order to have the seminars take place there. So these seminars were carefully tape recorded on high quality equipment. And then we had each seminar transcribed from the recordings, and then the transcriptions were lightly edited because it wasn't not just Bohm presenting, it was also a lot of back and forth question and answer with the audience. So the transcriptions were lightly edited by me or somebody else, and then Bohm would review and edit the transcripts. And so then we would make copies of these transcripts and make them available for sale at the seminar the following year. So Bohm conducted these seminars on the premises of the Oak Grove School each year after Krishnamurti died. He did this in 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, and 1990. And this is important because those transcripts of those seminars represent the main legacy that we have, the primary expression of Bohm's views in the psychological field. So let me show them to you. These are the transcripts of the seminars that Bohm conducted. It's altogether about 1,200 pages. This is what the first ones looked like, and later on we got a little bit more sophisticated and it looked like this. And then the seminar that he conducted in 1990, we submitted the transcript of that to his publisher in England, Routledge. And it was published as a book called Thought as a System. And this is that book. And so that is one widely available publication that expresses Bohm's views in the psychological field. So when I say that this is the undiscovered continent of David Bohm's worldview, that's a little bit of an exaggeration because there is one book which is available, but even that book is not really very widely known, and the transcripts are hardly, of the other seminars are hardly known at all, and they contain a lot of other material which is not in Thought as a System. So it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say it's undiscovered, but it's no exaggeration at all to say it's a continent. It's a huge amount of material, about 1,200 pages altogether. And my talk today is going to include an attempt to synthesize kind of very briefly, kind of the central core of the material presented in those seminars. Now, Bohm took these seminars very seriously, and I know this because during those years, in the days before each seminar, I used to go up to the Bohm flat every afternoon about 3 or 3:30 and have tea with David and Cyril, and then Bohm and I would go for a walk for an hour and a half. And all through the walk, he would be reviewing the material that he wanted to present in the seminar and organizing it and asking me if certain points were clear. And each year he had new material. He didn't just present the same material every year. There was always some overlap, but there are always also new elements, new ideas he wanted to introduce, new ways of expressing things. So for each seminar, we probably spent 12 or 15 hours walking and talking together beforehand, all the things he wanted to discuss. And then when it came time to actually give the seminar, it all came out completely organized and lucid he never used any notes, referred to any written material. He just had it, and it all came out. So in the film, David Peat tells the story of Bohm asking him one day whether he should just give up physics and devote himself completely to Krishnamurti. And Peat says that Bohm wanted to have his brain transformed, but that was really kind of a misunderstanding. What Bohm wanted was not to have his brain transformed. What he wanted was to have greater understanding of human psychology, of human consciousness. And his idea was not to devote himself to Krishnamurti personally, but to the kind of work that Krishnamurti represented. So then when David Peat said, can the goldfish exist outside the goldfish bowl? It kind of a little bit suggests that maybe Bohm decided not to devote himself to this psychological work. But I think the evidence, suggests otherwise. Bohm never gave up physics, but his interest and involvement in psychological understanding was very deep and powerful, and continued right to the end of his life. So Bohmian psychology is very much influenced by Krishnamurti's philosophy, but it also includes some additional elements. And the whole thing is expressed in Bohm's own language with his colorful metaphors and examples and so on. And so what Bohm did was to distill some of the essential elements of Krishnamurti's philosophy and fine-tune it in certain respects. I would say that maybe 60% or 70% of Bohmian psychology kind of overlaps with Krishnamurti's teaching, and the rest comes from his background in science and his study of Hegel, and from various other people, including Piaget and Freud and Korzybski, as well, of course, as well as his own unique and original insights. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Krishnamurti, but if you want to learn more about his relationship with Bohm, that is the subject of my previous book, An Uncommon Collaboration, which came out in 2017. And it was because of that book that I met Paul Howard at a conference in London and ended up being one of the people interviewed in the film. So that is the biographical introduction. And in a minute we'll start, and I'll try to start explaining some of the content of Bohmian psychology, but I thought we could pause at this point, and if people have any questions about what I've said so far, we can take maybe a couple of questions before we move on to the next part of my presentation.
Great, and you would like 10 minutes, right, for Q&A, then go back to the presentation?
Yeah, or we'll just see how many people, maybe people don't have any questions, or we'll just play it by ear a little bit.
Great. Well, I see Beth has a question for you, or a contribution.
I'm so delighted to hear the stories. That I just think your personal stories are so incredibly enriching. So I'm anxious for more. But one of the specific questions I would have, as somebody who's also delving deeply into David Bohm's life history and how that influences things, I have the book Thought as a System. Is there any way that the other documents that you mentioned are available? That's one question. And secondly, I really hope you're going to write up what you're going to tell us next, because I don't think it's been said in any way. So do you have plans to take that further and make it more available to those of us who want to suck it up?
Okay, well, those are two very good questions. I was afraid somebody was going to ask me if those transcripts are available, because I'm really not certain, but I believe that there is a repository of David Bohm materials on all subjects at Birkbeck College, where Basil Hiley works, and I'm pretty sure that there's copies of those transcripts there. and I think there's also a center in Israel. I think his wife Sarah started something in Israel, which was intended to include everything that Bohm produced during his lifetime. But I don't know how you can actually put your hands on the transcripts. And as for writing about this, I've entertained the idea for a long time, but I've been just occupied with other things. I would say that I consider it a possibility on the horizon. It hasn't quite materialized, but it could. And I appreciate the encouragement. Maybe that will kind of push me over the edge and get me started.
Great. Thank you, Beth, for asking that question. I see Eddie has a question for you.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, David, for this part. It's very interesting. I'm so glad as well that you made that very strong point about David was not pursuing Eastern philosophy or Eastern mysticism, because that is an impression that I noticed had sort of come across. And of course, that wasn't the case at all. The other thing, just to say, I was at the 1989 seminar, and
oh, wow.
And it was an extraordinary experience. I have, I think, the transcript from the 1988 one. Beth, by the way, I can always, but in any case, there's extraordinary material in those seminars.
Absolutely. Thank you. Good point.
Did you remember my Irish accent that time? No?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Thank you, Eddie. I can see in the chat, John has a question for you. If you would like to ask it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was wondering if, since they seemed to mostly align in their views, if you knew if they had any major disagreements in any areas.
Okay, so that's an interesting subject, and I don't think they had major disagreements with respect to the content of their views about consciousness or the psychological field, but they did have quite a significant conflict in their personal relationship, which it was not like an emotional thing between them, but it had to do with the publication of a series of dialogues they had. In 1975, they had a series of 12 dialogues which were supposed to be published. And at the last minute, one of the trustees of the Krishnamurti Foundation in England intervened. This was Krishnamurti's original biographer, Mary Lutchins, and she objected very strongly to the publication. And that caused a pretty significant degree of discord between the two of them, which took a long time to overcome. All of that is described in detail and Uncommon Collaboration. But with respect to the content of their views about psychology and consciousness, I'm not aware of any significant differences. There's a difference in the way they approached it. There's a difference in the way they expressed it. Because Krishnamurti, this is very important, and I'm glad you raised that. It's not exactly what you asked, because it wasn't like a point of conflict between them, but there was a difference in the way they expressed their views, because Krishnamurti, as far as one could tell, Krishnamurti was speaking from what you might consider direct, immediate perception, whereas Bohm was working more at the level of like a map of the territory. And he knew he was doing that. He said, I'm making a map of the territory. And Krishnamurti, I don't think would ever have said, I'm making a map of the territory. He was talking directly about what he actually perceived about the nature of consciousness and human psychology. And that's kind of a subtle difference. It might not show up to people who are not very familiar with it, but it is a significant distinction between them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for asking that question. I see Peter has a question for you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. David, can you talk a little bit about the school that Krishnamurti founded. I mean, I noticed in the picture there were boys and girls there. I mean, did they have to take an examination to enter? I rather think it must be comparable in a way to the Rudolf Steiner schools, where the education was very, very broad, quite different from the normal educational syllabus in England. I imagine, yes. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
So I never spent any time at Brockwood Park. I was very involved with the Oak Grove School in California, which was very different because Oak Grove, first of all, it's elementary through high school, and secondly, it's a day school, whereas Brockwood Park is a boarding school for secondary students, which creates a whole different set of issues. And I don't believe they have an entrance examination, but they do take academic work quite seriously. This was an issue that came up at Oak Grove. Some of the parents were concerned, well, this is Krishnamurti school, you guys are very progressive and you a little bit disparaging about, knowledge and academic subjects. Are you really a serious academic school? And Krishnamurti emphasized that it was very important to have very high quality academic work, the field of knowledge and understanding academics. He considered very important. He just considered that it was limited and there was much more to life than that. So I think Brockwood Park is similar in the sense that they take the academic work seriously, but the kind of the center of gravity of the purpose of the school has more to do with the quality of relationships among the people and the broader questions about what kind of life they want to live and, their relationship outside of school and outside of academic subjects. And I know that the graduates of that school go on to quite good colleges and universities. But, and I know that, England has a pretty strict set of examinations which come up at the end of secondary school, and Brockwood Park students have to take those exams just like anybody else. And I think that's how they get access to universities. That's my understanding.
Yeah, the school in America, I assume because Krishnamurti had founded it, would be oversubscribed. So I assume there must have been some selection process to choose which people were admitted.
Well, you have to understand that in the United States, Krishnamurti is not that well known, and he's not necessarily that much admired. When he was alive, there was more attention given to him, a little bit, but in the early years of the school, we always were worried about enrollment, and we wanted more and more than we had. But now the school has grown, and now, as I said, it has more than 200 students in kindergarten through grade 12, and it's very much in demand. The applicants to be enrolled in the school far outnumber the available places. But that's more because of the reputation that the school has developed. It's such a beautiful campus, beautiful buildings, high quality teachers, very interesting curriculum. It's not because people are that interested in Krishnamurti. People in the United States, especially now that he's been dead for a few decades, they hardly even know who Krishnamurti is. And if they do, they're not really that interested. As I said before, they think, oh, Indian philosopher, I know what that means. I don't have to look anymore to see what that guy's talking about. That's kind of the popular attitude in this country. Of course, there are, a minority of people who are more aware, but the attraction of Oak Grove School, it has less to do with his philosophy than just the fact that it's a very good school.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll take one more, if there's one more question, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Sure. Anyone like to ask a question?
Is that it?
I think so. I actually have a bit of a follow-up question from Peter's question. How does the school in Ojai, how does it differ from your classic American school?
Class size is smaller, considerably smaller. There's emphasis on the quality of relationship between teacher and student. They, that learning is encouraged for its own sake, not something that you compete to excel and beat your fellow students. The whole principle of reward and punishment is as motivating factors and ways of shaping student behavior is all thrown out the window. No reward, no punishment, no competition, and major emphasis on cultivating good behavior in the students, because students want to behave, they want to cooperate, they want to be part of a set of relationships which are meaningful and worthwhile to them. My first book, before these two books that I've told you about, was just about the Oak Grove School, about the development of the school. It's called The Unconditioned Mind. And it goes into all these questions in detail. It describes the story of Krishnamurti's involvement in that school and what we were trying to achieve in terms of the philosophy. And there were a lot of conflicts in those years because as a day school, a lot of families moved to Ojai during those years in order to put their kids in the school. And the role of the parents was very, very strong. And parents had very strong ideas and often conflicting ideas about, what a Krishnamurti school ought to be. So it generated a lot of pretty fertile activity, which is described in that book.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, David, for that.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want to keep going with your presentation?
Okay, so now we will proceed with the second part of my talk, which is going to be the longest part and the most sort of intense, because it is my effort to convey, to try to distill those 1,200 pages of seminar transcripts into just a 45-minute talk, which of course is completely impossible, but I'm going to try to at least give you a little flavor of what Bohmian psychology is all about. So, as I said, Bohmian psychology is based to a large extent on the philosophy of Krishnamurti. And so I really should call it Krishnamurti Bohmian psychology, but that gets to be a little bit awkward. And also Bohm, contributed some original elements of his own. So I'm just going to call it Bohmian psychology, with the understanding that a great deal of it is derived from or coincides with the teachings of Krishnamurti. Now, their approach to the field of psychology is unlike conventional psychology in several respects. First of all, they're not concerned about discussing differences among people based on, demographic differences or cultural differences. And also, they're not concerned with describing individual kinds of psychological disorders, such as, depression or bipolar illness or something like that. Instead, they take as their subject matter the whole of humanity, the whole human race, the species of Homo sapiens, and that's the subject matter that they deal with. And because they have an unusual subject matter, everything that follows is also unusual and highly original. So I would say that Bohmian psychology takes as its point of departure what I would call the total global human disorder. And what I mean by that is we have war, we have environmental degradation, climate change, extreme economic exploitation, inequality, racial hatreds, religious hatreds, the oppression and exploitation of women, domestic violence, and So Bohmian psychology poses the question, what is the source? What is the origin of this global human disorder? And a lot of people might think, well, there is no one source, one particular source. But Krishnamurti and Bohm look at this as a totality, and they look at whether or not there's an underlying source of all of this disorder. And they're not the only ones who've ever considered this kind of question. Other people have suggested possible reasons like evil, which is inherent in some human beings, and some evolutionary psychologists have said that through evolution and survival of the fittest, the human species has an innate tendency towards aggression or tribalism, dominance. People who subscribe to a particular political ideology or religion, they might think, well, the problem with mankind is that, the rest of the world doesn't believe in my ideology or my religion. And, Freud had an explanation. He wrote that book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which says that there's an inherent conflict between civilization, between the demands of the collective and our individual instincts. And that's the origin of all of the difficulties in the human race. And so Bohmian psychology proposes that there's another origin entirely for the global human disorder. And Bohm says that the problem fundamentally lies in our failure, our collective failure to understand the nature and the function of thought. And Bohm, of course, he recognizes and acknowledges the tremendous achievements of thought in art and science and technology and all of civilization. So he realizes that it's kind of odd to attribute our difficulties to thought. He says that it's like saying, going to the doctor is what's making you sick, because thought is the tool that we universally use to solve all of our problems. But Bohmian psychology says there's a great deal about thought that is not well understood. He says we normally give our attention to the content of thought, which is our particular ideas and beliefs and concepts and opinions. And he says we give very little attention to the process of thought, the manner in which it works. And he says there's some potential flaws in the process of thought which arise no matter what the subject matter is. And these flaws in the process then can feed over and interfere with the subject matter in ways which are unpredictable and often dangerous. So to understand Bohmian psychology, we're going to begin by looking at some of the characteristics of the process of thought, which Bohm says lead to potential difficulty. And one of these, we can begin with an easy one that people generally acknowledge and understand, and that is that a great deal of thought proceeds on the basis of assumptions. And assumptions are part of thought, but they're usually implicit, so we don't pay too much attention to them. And for the most part, that's a good thing. That's the way assumptions are supposed to work. Bohm gives the example that if I want to walk across the room, I have the assumption that the floor will be solid and I won't fall through it anywhere. And normally that's a good assumption, it's useful. And part of its value is precisely that we don't have to think about it, we take it for granted. But because we don't usually think about our assumptions, we often don't even realize that we have them. And when people disagree about issues that are important to them, very often the basis of their disagreement is they're proceeding on the basis of different assumptions. And very often their arguments don't penetrate to that level, so they never really understand why they can't get along. And in the film, Bohm gave the example of Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. And here were two men of the highest intelligence, both very dedicated to scientific understanding. And yet on a very important issue, they couldn't come to an agreement or understanding. And it's not as though they didn't talk about it, they talked about it a great deal, but they came to an impasse. And Bohm says that was because they were operating on the basis of different assumptions, which they probably weren't even entirely aware of. So assumptions are one of the characteristics of the process of thought that lead to confusion and difficulty if we're not aware of them, or if we resist examining them. And this kind of confusion and difficulty is what Bohm would call incoherence. He says if we can't be aware of our assumptions and question them when necessary, it leads to incoherence in our thinking and in our actions. And Bohm used to use a metaphor to describe the way we should hold on to our assumptions. He said, think of a blind man who's walking along and holding a stick to tap the ground ahead of him as he walks. He said, if he grips the stick very, very tightly, then he can't really use it to tap and sense the ground ahead of him. But if he holds the stick too loosely, then the stick is also useless and he's liable to drop it. So the blind man needs to hold the stick with a reasonable amount of firmness, but not too much in order to make use of it. And Bohm says that's how we should hold on to our assumptions, firmly enough to make use of them, but not so tightly that they're counterproductive. So another important, very important attribute of the process of thought involves the issue of fragmentation. So we have to discuss this quite a bit. You know, the film brought out the central significance of wholeness as a primary feature of Bohm's understanding of cosmology. Bohm said that wholeness and interconnectedness are parts of quantum mechanics and of the implicate order. You know, Bohm said, undivided wholeness in flowing movement. It was the essence of the deep structure of the universe. But Bohmian psychology presents a very different portrait of the world, because the opposite or antithesis of wholeness is fragmentation. And Bohm considers fragmentation to be one of the main characteristics of the global human disorder. And he sees fragmentation taking place both outwardly in society and also inwardly within the individual. So one place where we can see fragmentation is in the relationships among nations, because in reality, all the nations of the world are very interdependent and dependent upon one another, and yet each nation considers itself to be essentially sovereign and independent of all of the others. And that's a form of fragmentation, according to Bohm. It's a kind of division that falsifies reality, and it leads to conflict and even to war. And another form of fragmentation occurs inwardly, and Bohm very often gave the example of how we separate thought from emotion. We consider that the thought and emotion belong in two separate spheres and have nothing in common. But Bohm shows that thought and feelings are really closely interconnected, so much so that they really should be regarded as just a single system. And he demonstrates this in terms of the structure of the brain and neurophysiology, and he gives examples from daily life. One of the examples he liked to give involves a man who's walking along the street alone at night, and up ahead he sees some shadows in the distance. He doesn't know what it is, and at first he thinks it might be something threatening. It might be some kind of assailant, and as a result, his nervous system, his heart and solar plexus are flooded with fear and anxiety. But then he looks more closely and he sees, oh no, it's not an assailant, it's just some trees, some branches fluttering in the wind. And so then all of the man's fear goes away. And so Bohm uses this example to show that the emotional reaction was just a product of the man's thinking. And that's one of the ways that Bohm shows that thought and feeling are so closely connected that we should not think of them as separate spheres. So Bohm says that fragmentation arises because of the process of thought, because thought consists mainly of words and concepts, and each word or concept is based upon some kind of definition that draws a border around the thing defined. And that border represents a limit. The definition says this thing is this and not that. And every definition represents a limitation. The very word definition is related to the word finite, which means that which is limited. So the entire sorry, excuse me one sec. The entire process of thought functions through constructing and defining the limits of things. And that process is very useful in many respects, but it tends to separate things in a way which is too categorical and not really faithful to reality. Bohm often gave the example of if you're drawing a map, sometimes it's appropriate to put a dotted line between things in order to indicate kind of a provisional or tentative separation between things. He says what thought does is instead of a dotted line, it draws a solid line to indicate, a very deep separation. And he says that falsifies reality to some extent, and that leads to fragmentation and therefore to conflict. So another important characteristic of thought is that it consists of a process of abstraction. Every thought is an abstraction from concrete reality. To abstract means to take out. It has a meaning similar to extract. And so a thought abstracts or takes out from the very complex world of reality, and it takes out the parts that are most salient or relevant, and it leaves behind what we consider to be less important. And therefore, every thought is more or less incomplete. Bohm liked to quote the linguistic philosopher Korzybski, who said, whatever we say anything is, it isn't. And what that means is that abstraction is always incomplete. And that's part of what makes it useful, but it also leads to difficulties if we forget about or lose track of that incompleteness. So these are just some clues as to why thought is problematical in ways we're not fully aware of, but these characteristics really just lay a kind of foundation. And what we have to do is we have to build on that foundation in order to see where the real trouble is and how the process of thought can become associated with the global human disorder. So we've seen the process of thought includes making assumptions and using definitions and limits for words and concepts and making abstractions. And the net effect is that thought produces what Bohm calls representations of the world. Thought really consists of these representations, which we use to communicate with one another and for almost everything we do. And Bohm says that when we're consciously thinking of some thought or representation, that's what he calls explicit thought. And after we finish with that thought, we feel like it just goes away. It feels like thought is insubstantial and ephemeral. And after I stop thinking a thought, it's gone. But Bohm says that's not correct. He says every thought we have leaves a trace in our memory, and after it's no longer explicit, it remains as what he calls implicit thought. And implicit thought, he says, has very powerful effects of which we're not aware. And to understand the effects of implicit thought, we have to consider the connection between thought and ordinary perception, because our eyes and ears and mental perceptions create what Bohm calls a presentation in consciousness. This presentation is just the immediate input of our perception, our senses and awareness. And thought is a form of knowledge or memory that is a representation or a representation. And the trouble begins when the representation enters into the presentation. Because once the representation gets stored in memory as implicit thought, It's ready to move into perception and shape our awareness of the world. And according to Bohm, this is a very crucial move because the representation enters into, infuses with perception, with presentation of consciousness in a way that we're not fully aware of. So you can get kind of a preliminary general sense of this idea if you think about what happens when you enter a house that you've never been to before. If it's new and unfamiliar, you have to look around and see where the furniture is and how the rooms are connected. But when you enter your own house, you don't have to observe so carefully. And that's because your memory of the house, which is a representation stored up in implicit thought, it enters into your perception in a very immediate way, and it fuses with your perception as if it were part of it. And this is a crucial move because it happens without our being aware of it. Implicit thought acts very quickly, immediately. And as a result, we take the representation as if it were part of reality instead of a memory introduced into awareness by thought. And in many respects, this is a good and useful process. It helps us navigate the world and do everything we do in daily life. But the difficulty arises when the representation enters into the perception in a way that is false or no longer accurate. For example, suppose we have formed a memory or a representation of a certain person having certain characteristics. Then the next time we see that person, the representation enters in and we feel we're actually perceiving the person in that manner. So if someone has told me that immigrants are rapists and murderers, then when I see an immigrant, I may actually perceive the person in that way. I won't realize that it's my memory, my representation that is entering into my perception and creating what I see. I will sense it as my actual immediate perception of that person. So Bohm says this is the beginning of how the process of thought can contribute to human disorder, because we actually see our competitors or foreign groups as enemies who are infected with qualities that are really just produced by our memory, by representations contained in implicit thought. Now, Bohm describes this problem by saying that thought is not aware of its own movement. He says, when the representation moves out of memory as if it were part of perception, we don't see that movement, it just goes of its own accord. And he contrasts this with what happens when we move our body physically. If I move my arm, the nervous system is arranged in such a way that I get immediate sensory feedback that tells me that I've moved my arm. It's not just that I can sense that my arm has been moved, I can sense that my arm has moved as a result of my intention. And Bohm says this kind of awareness is called proprioception. That's a word that basically means self-awareness. And we have this kind of sensory awareness of our own movements, but thought does not have that kind of awareness. When thought moves, we have no sensory feedback to tell us that thought is operating. In other words, thought is not proprioceptive. And Bohm often gave the example of a woman he knew who one night had a stroke while she was sleeping in the middle of the night. And this particular stroke had the effect of turning off all of the sensory receptors in her arm. So as a result, she could no longer feel anything in her arm, but she still had the motor neurons that enabled her to move her arm. So what happened is she woke up that night, in the middle of the night after she had this stroke, and she felt something touching her face, and she didn't know what it was. So she started struggling against it. And the more she struggled, the more this thing became more and more aggressive. And finally, after a while, she succeeded in turning on the light and nobody was there. And eventually it became apparent to her that because of the stroke, she had lost this sensation, including the proprioception in her arm. And it was her own arm that she was struggling against in the dark. And Bohm maintains this is analogous to what is taking place with thought. He says thought is not aware of its own movement, so it's constantly creating effects that it's not aware that it produced. And then it struggles against those effects without realizing that it is the source of what it is struggling against. And Bohm uses the word incoherence to describe this process. If you're fighting against consequences that you yourself have created, that is incoherent. And he maintains that as one of the fundamental characteristics of the process of thought, which leads to a whole complex series of consequences, and ultimately to the global human disorder. So all of this creates the first of two very problematic areas of confusion and disorder. The representations contained in implicit thought enter into our present perception and fuse with it in a way that we're not aware of. And that causes us to mistake past memories for present actualities, which leads to all kinds of destructive effects in human relationships. So now we're going to look at a second problematic area, a second way in which assumptions and defining limits and forming abstractions combine to create a very serious set of problems. And to understand the second area, we have to remember that thought creates representations of almost everything it sees. And that's what produces science and technology and art and almost everything we see in civilization. So then comes the question, what kinds of representations have we formed about thought itself? What are the assumptions that we have about how thought functions, about its process? And Bohm would say that each of us shares in a common set of ideas and beliefs about the nature of thought. And those ideas are really embedded in thought itself. So the way he would pose this question is to say, what representations does thought make about itself? And so if you examine this question, the first thing to notice has to do with how we define what is thought, or as Bohm would put it, how does thought implicitly define itself? What are the borders or limits of thought? And this is one place where Bohm says that our implicit ideas about thought go completely off the rails. He considers that, he considers thought to consist, he says we consider thought to consist primarily of just, whatever is going on in our minds at any given moment. We think that thought is the intellectual function of the brain, and they're ephemeral and insubstantial and mostly confined within the mental space of our minds. And Bohm says that that's, completely incorrect. We've already seen that Bohm says we have the assumption that thought and emotion are distinct and separate from one another. And he rejects that idea. He says thought and emotion are reflections of one another, and they can't really be effectively distinguished. And we've also seen that the representations in implicit thought act in such a way that they move into our present perception of the world. And so that's another way that thoughts are not confined to the intellectual space inside our minds. And then in addition, thoughts are constantly being communicated from one person to another, flowing between people and among people. So my thoughts become your thoughts and vice versa. So thought is circulating throughout the body and nervous system and all through society and culture. And all of these thoughts form a kind of network, which is a huge interconnected set of ideas and beliefs and assumptions and information that collectively form a huge unified system. So the idea that thoughts are just an ephemeral, insubstantial phenomenon confined to our individual minds is completely erroneous. Thought is a system, according to Bohm. It's an all-pervasive network that flows all through each individual as well as through society. And this idea is so fundamental to Bohmian psychology that the one book he has in this field is titled Thought as a System. And this is part of what he means to convey by that title. So now we're going to come to the very core of Bohmian psychology, which is the place where we find the most confusion in the process of thought, the greatest degree of incoherence, and the primary source of disorder. And for this, we have to come back to our implicit thoughts about thought itself and ask, what do we regard as the source or origin of our thoughts? Or as Bohm put it, what does thought consider to be the source or origin of itself? And, you know, most or all of us believe that inwardly we have a self, what we call I or me. And when we're thinking, we feel like I am thinking. My thoughts are coming from a psychological entity that is me, or what we can refer to as the thinker. And thought believes that the thinker is the source or origin of our thoughts. But according to Bohmian psychology, this point of view is deeply false. He says the thinker is just a representation created by thought that has no actual substance. He says it's a show, it's an appearance that does not correspond to anything that actually exists. It's illusory. He says it has the same degree of reality as a rainbow, because when you see a rainbow, there's no actual thing in the sky that corresponds to what we see. And, you know, by way of contrast, if you see a mountain in the distance, it's real. You can travel towards it and get closer to it and eventually arrive at the mountain, but you can't do that with a rainbow. You can't move closer to it because there's nothing there to move closer to. You know, a rainbow is just the appearance of something created by light reflecting off of water droplets in the sky. And in the same way, the thinker, which is the I, the self, the ego, is just an appearance. It's a representation created by thought. In other words, it is thought which is producing the thinker, not the thinker which is creating thought. And this is a very deep and fundamental mistake. It has profound consequences for daily life and the global human disorder. And the reason this illusion has such important and dangerous consequences is because we attach enormous significance to the thinker. The brain interprets the psychological self as having the same value as the physical self. You know, we consider the health and well-being of the psychological self as important as the physical self. And as a result, we'll do anything necessary to defend it. And we don't really have time to go into much detail about how and why the psychological self creates so much conflict, but I'll just give one brief example to illustrate the kind of problem it creates. Because one of the characteristics of the psychological self is that we get attached to all kinds of beliefs and ideas, and we identify ourselves with our nation or culture or religion. And so if somebody belongs to a different nation or religion, or they have different beliefs, that's potentially a threat. And we feel like if you threaten my ideas or beliefs, you threaten not just the ideas, but me. And we said at the start of this presentation that thought proceeds on the basis of assumptions. And that's a very good and useful characteristic of thought, until the time comes when we need to question the assumptions. And, you know, if we identify ourselves with our assumptions, then we feel like if someone questions them or challenges them, they're challenging me. And we feel threatened in a very deep way in our very self. And so we'll refuse to examine the assumptions. On the contrary, we'll fight to defend it and refuse to give it up, no matter what may be the cost. So Bohm says that our failure to understand the process of thought creates conflict and incoherence, both inwardly and outwardly. And above all, we have an illusory concept of the source of thought, the thinker, the psychological self. We attach ultimate significance to an illusory being that just has no reality. So this is a very brief outline of how the process of thought gets deeply involved in illusion and incoherence and disorder. And if I may remind you, you know, if you feel like this is not a totally convincing explanation of the source of global human disorder, you have to remember that I'm condensing about 1,200 pages of seminar transcripts into just one 45-minute talk. And, you know, what I call the undiscovered continent of Bohmian psychology is very, very much richer, more subtle, more complex, and more detailed than what I presented here. And just to give you some idea of what I've left out of this presentation, this is a list of some of the topics that are important parts of Bohmian psychology that I haven't had time to talk about. So if anyone wanted to critique my talk based on how much I have left out, they could have a field day, and I would be the first to agree with them. And that's why I say that Bohmian psychology is a whole undiscovered continent of Bohm's worldview. But just to give you a little sample, a little taste of what I've left out, I want to share with you one portion of one of these topics, which is the unlimited. You know, as we discussed, we talked about how thought works through words and concepts, each of which is defined by establishing limits. And as a result, the whole field of thought is also limited. It may seem very vast to us, but the field of thought, which includes all of knowledge, is always limited. And so this can raise the question, you know, where is the unlimited in this picture? Is there anything at all in the universe, physically or psychologically or spiritually, that is unlimited? And if there is, how can we have access to it? And Bohm says that our minds are so occupied and crowded with the limited knowledge of thought. It's like being in a city like Las Vegas at night. He says there's so many artificial lights and they occupy all of our attention. And it seems like that's all that actually exists. But if you could turn off all those artificial lights in Las Vegas, then you would be able to see something infinitely more, which is the night sky. You know, the light of the stars coming from enormous, incalculable distances. And that, he said, would be like turning off the limited activity of thought and knowledge and coming into contact with the unlimited. So I need to acknowledge also that, you know, I was asked to discuss Krishnamurti's influence on Bohm, and I haven't said much about that. And but actually Krishnamurti's philosophy is incorporated in much of what I've described, but it's implicit in the language of Bohmian psychology, and that means that it's much more powerful there. And on the other hand, Bohm took Krishnamurti's observations and insights and he made them his own. You know, he never accepted anything uncritically just because Krishnamurti had said it. And, you know, he added so many interesting and colorful metaphors, like the woman who was struggling against her arm at night because she lost proprioception, and the blind man tapping the stick ahead of him, and the, you know, the image of the artificial lights in Las Vegas blocking out the light of the stars and the unlimited. You know, Krishnamurti would never have included anything like those beautiful metaphors. But if you want to know more about Krishnamurti, he really has an extraordinary life. And so again, my biography goes into the whole story of his life, including some material that people might consider critical or less attractive. You know, his love affairs, lawsuits that he was involved in, and all the important objective facts about his life. And since I haven't said enough about Krishnamurti, I thought you might also enjoy seeing this photograph. This is a photo of the lunch table in Ojai, and you know, a great many interesting conversations took place here. You know, this is Krishnamurti talking with Pupil Jayakar, who wrote a very important biography of Krishnamurti's life in India. And that's me sitting next to Pupil. And next to Krishnamurti is Friedrich Grohe, who is a very close friend of Krishnamurti, and he's still involved in Krishnamurti's work. So to come back to where we left off a few minutes ago, we've described in very brief terms Bohm's diagnosis for the source of the global human disorder, but Bohmian psychology also includes a few prescriptions or remedies for this disorder, and I'll take a few minutes to discuss his remedies. So we've already mentioned that Bohm says that one thing that would alleviate the problems of thought is proprioception, but Bohm is not sure that proprioception of thought can ever be achieved. He kind of leaves it as an open question. But he does provide two other remedies for the problems in thought, and one of these is what he calls insight. Bohm maintains that our consciousness is mostly occupied with thought, but we also have the capacity for perception and awareness and intelligence, and these faculties are independent of thought. And Bohm distinguishes intelligence from intellect. He says the intellect operates within the field of thought. It uses logic, reason, analysis, and it's extremely useful, but because it operates within the field of thought, it's somewhat limited. And he says intelligence is not the intellect. In Bohmian psychology, intelligence is a much more free and fluid capacity. It's not bound by preconceived assumptions, and it perceives in a way that is new and original. And insight is a kind of refinement. It's a distillation of intelligence. It occurs in a flash, unexpectedly, when the mind sees into the heart or essence of the problem. And it's the source of important discoveries in science and art and human relationship. So Bohm says that everything that we've discussed about the process of thought represents a kind of map of territory. He says that that description is good for guiding awareness and attention, but the description can't free us from the problems. In order to end the illusion of the thinker, for example, we need more than the description. We need an insight. And it's only an insight that can actually dispel an illusion, like the illusion of the thinker. So insight is one of the remedies for the problems described in Bohmian psychology. And another remedy is a group process that he calls dialogue. And but before we get into that, I think we should pause and see if there's any additional questions about what I've said so far, and then we'll try to describe the process of dialogue very briefly.
Great, yes, let's take 5 minutes for Q&A. I can see Katrina already has her hand up.
It's Valjean. Yeah.
Oh, no, I see. Sorry, Katrina Boss. I will get to you, Valjean, don't worry.
Yeah.
Hi there. Hi, David. So this may be a dumb question, but I'm kind of stuck on the idea that if there's no thinker, then where do the thoughts come from? I understand the rainbow analogy, but what if the rainbow's singing? Like, I'm missing something, and I guess it's maybe in 1,200 pages, but.
Right. Yes, it is in the 1,200 pages, but I think just to answer briefly, I think we just have to say that, thoughts are just a spontaneous product of the brain. The brain produces thoughts spontaneously. There's not this little spiritual self inside which is doing it. It's just a spontaneous manifestation of the brain, just like an organ of the body produces bile, the thought produces, the brain produces thoughts. That's a very brief answer, but kind of give you the general idea.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Katrina. Valjean, you had a question?
Yes, I'm just going back a little bit to the trace that is left after the representational thought. And it occurred to me also that when you spoke about insight, are we approaching intuition at this point? And how does intuition fit into the process of thought? Because it seems to me intuition is almost as spontaneous as insight is, but it's not the same.
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer, on behalf of Bohm, because his question has come up in his seminars. And I think what Bohm would say is that the word intuition can mean different things to different people. And he's a little bit hesitant to use that word because sometimes it has connotations which are not necessarily what he intends. So he's not categorically against that idea, but he tends to avoid that word and prefers to stick with insight or intelligence. This is also related to truth, but that's another much more complicated thing. So I would say that, possibly intuition, but maybe be a little hesitant about using that word.
Thank you. Intuition doesn't always have, I was just going to add that intuition doesn't always have a recognizable thought pattern.
Absolutely, quite right.
Thank you, Bo, Jean. If it's okay with you, David, I'll take just one more question, then go on with the presentation, just because we're a bit tighter on time. Is that okay with you? Take just one more question?
Sure, you bet.
Okay, great. So I can see Dawn has another question for you.
Hi, thanks. This is really fascinating. So mine was from the chat box a bit further up, but in The First and Last Freedom, I know that Aldous Huxley gave the foreword, and I know that we were also quite close. So do you happen to know if Bohm and Huxley ever also spoke before Huxley passed, or even if Krishnamurti and Bohm spoke in their dialogues about Huxley, particularly with regards to the perennial philosophy, which seems to align a lot with Bohm's idea of wholeness? I guess I'll leave it at that since I know they're tight for time.
Okay, so not to my knowledge, I'm not aware that Bohm met Huxley or that Krishnamurti and Bohm discussed Huxley, but you're certainly right to raise the significance of Huxley, and that foreword to First and Last Freedom is quite an interesting document. It's about 10 pages. It's a very detailed and kind of dense description of Bohm's of Huxley's understanding of Krishnamurti philosophy. And those two men were very close. Krishnamurti and Huxley were very close with one another. In my book, I suggest that Huxley may have been the closest actual friendship that Krishnamurti ever formed, and he speaks about him in very positive ways. During World War II, they were both, stuck in Southern California, and they spent a great deal of time together, and it was quite a compatible relationship. Okay, so
thank you, John.
Move on then, James.
Yeah, sure. If you're happy with that.
Okay, right. So then we come to the third part of my talk, which fortunately is a lot briefer than the other parts. So there's this group process that Bohm invented, which we're going to call Bohm dialogue, which is designed as a kind of a prescription for what ails the human condition. And Bohm dialogue has some outward characteristics and some inward psychological characteristics. And when I've heard people in the past try to describe what Bohm dialogue is, very often they begin by describing the outward characteristics as if that's sort of, the essence of the matter. And then kind of as a supplement, they bring in the inward characteristics. But that's not really what Bohm had in mind. It was the inward activity, the inward characteristics that were the most important for him, and the outward were just designed to facilitate the inward part. So I'm going to begin by describing the inward process of Bohm dialogue, and then we'll bring in the outward part to show how it relates. So according to Bohm, every society has a culture of one kind or another. And a good and healthy culture is based on what he calls shared meaning. He says shared meaning involves a common sense of significance and value and purpose. He says in a healthy culture, people's ideas about what is significant, what has value, and what is a collective purpose, all of those ideas flow easily and freely among the people, and it's that shared meaning that creates a culture. And he says the problems in society arise when the culture becomes fragmented, which means there's blocks to the free flow of meaning among people. People become isolated from one another and they become polarized, and instead of a collective shared meaning, you get various subgroups which arise, and the subgroups may share meaning among themselves, but not with the rest of society. So Bohm says that kind of fragmentation is responsible for a great deal of disorder and incoherence. And his dialogue is designed to serve as a remedy for that fragmentation. So the essential idea is that people will meet to talk over whatever's on their minds, and as they talk, they will inevitably find they disagree and have different ideas about things. And according to Bohm, these disagreements almost always arise because people are thinking on the basis of different assumptions. So the starting point of the dialogue is to hear the ideas of people that are different from my own ideas. And in that way, I will become aware of my assumptions. And Bohm emphasized that people are strongly identified with and attached to their assumptions. And so to sit and listen to people who have very different assumptions is often very disturbing. So people in a dialogue group may become emotional or agitated, and they may feel the ideas expressed by the other person are really outrageous and offensive. And so the participants may get angry and even enraged, or they may get frustrated and discouraged, and often they will have a strong incentive to give up and abandon the whole process of dialogue. But in a real Bohm dialogue, all of these clashes and disagreements and emotional reactions are not a problem to be avoided. Not at all. On the contrary, the whole point of the dialogue is to elicit these differences of views and emotional actions, bring them out into the open. And so Bohm says that engaging in this kind of dialogue is like climbing Mount Everest. He says it'll be extremely challenging and demanding and difficult. And there'll be a strong incentive to give it up and go home. And people will only continue with it if they understand it's very important to work through all of these disagreements and antagonism. So if someone in the dialogue group starts saying something that I consider outrageous and offensive, then I become aware of my own assumptions. And the challenge for me at that moment, according to Bohm, is what he calls to suspend my assumptions. And this is the crucial psychological move of the whole dialogue. To suspend my assumptions means I don't express it, but neither do I repress it. He says to suspend it is to balance the assumption on a knife's edge. It's not repressed and also not expressed. And the point of that is so I can really see and become fully aware of my assumption and how the assumption is triggering all of my emotional disturbance. But it's important to recognize that suspending your assumptions is not as easy as it may sound. You have to understand what's happening at that moment, which is that, someone that you consider to be a jerk on the other side of the room has just said something so false and offensive that, you almost feel like you want to strangle him or at least yell at him. And your own point of view does not feel like an assumption. It feels like a fact or an obvious truth and a vitally important truth. And yet that is what Bohm dialogue is asking you to suspend. So it's not quite as easy as it may sound. So that is the essential inward psychological activity of Bohm dialogue. Ideally, everyone in the group is suspending their own assumptions and observing not only their own, but everyone else's assumptions. And the point is not to do anything about it, but just to be aware of the whole process, to learn about my own assumptions and how they are connected with my emotions and my overall state of mind. Now, the outward characteristics of a dialogue are simply those things that will facilitate the inner process. And so one of the most important things is you have to have enough people to generate the expression of different points of view. If there's only 7 or 8 people, Bohm says they will avoid the difficult issues. And that will miss the whole point of the dialogue. Bohm says a small group will create what he calls a cozy adjustment to one another, and all the underlying assumptions will not be brought to the surface. So he says the ideal number of participants is about 20 to 40. He says you need to have at least 20 or so people in order to guarantee a robust amount of disagreement. But you can't have more than about 40 because that makes it too difficult to sit together and hear one another and for everyone to participate. And in addition, the Bohm dialogue is not supposed to have any fixed agenda. There's supposed to be a free flow of meaning, so people can't be restricted to any particular topic. And anyway, the subject matter is not the main point. The main point is to observe your own assumptions and emotional reactions, regardless of what is being discussed. And finally, the Bohm dialogue is not supposed to have anyone in charge, no leader or moderator or authority. There might be somebody who initiates the dialogue and explains how it's supposed to work, but after that, that person is just supposed to become one of the participants. So Bohm often referred to a kind of mythical period of time before civilization when people were living in tribes, people who were hunters and gatherers. And he says they got together and engaged in this kind of dialogue spontaneously on a regular basis. He says they didn't have any particular agenda or leader guiding the discussion. They just talked things over. And after a while, they knew what they wanted to do. And I think this image might have created a somewhat romantic vision of what Bohm dialogue might be. You know, people might think, oh, we're going to have a dialogue with no leader and no agenda, and then we'll have a free flow of meaning, with wholeness and interconnectedness, you know, just like those pre-civilization hunter-gatherer people. But we have to remember that those hunter-gatherers grew up in a culture where this process had been going on all their lives. They didn't just jump into it at the age of 32 or 58 or whatever. So the process that Bohm describes is really quite different. It's a process where it's crucial for the fragmentation that already exists in society to become manifest, to come to the surface and be exposed, and for each of the participants to learn how they're contributing to the fragmentation. So inevitably, there's a lot of antagonism and frustration, and you have to be dedicated. You have to be as much as if you wanted to climb Mount Everest in order to work through all of that. So Bohm says that such a group would have to meet 2 or 3 times a month for many months, maybe years, before they could really get to the point of a free flow of meaning. And only then they might begin to be more like the pre-civilization hunter-gatherer tribes that he was fond of describing. So that's Bohm dialogue, and that's the end of my presentation, but we still have a few minutes left if there are any remaining questions.
Thank you so much, David. Actually, a question has literally just popped up from Ellen. Would you like to ask that question?
Yes, I think I may have misunderstood something, but I was troubled by the one statement earlier on when you were talking about thought, that there was some suggestion that the physical was more real, that it felt like a kind of reduction to a material truth or a physical truth, and from a psychological point of view or phenomenological approach, basically all we have is our perception, veridical or not. And I'm sure David Bohm wasn't saying what I'm saying, but I'm wondering if you could clarify that.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it was that I said, I'm not sure what I said that you're referring to. So
there was one sentence about equating either thought or I believe it was equating thought with the physical, and the implication was that the physical contained the greater reality, that the thought was the representation and the physical was real. And if you didn't say that, then that's what I heard.
I don't think, that doesn't ring any bells. I don't think I said that. I must have said something which sounded like that, and I'm struggling to try to think what it was, but I can't get a connection. So I just have to say, I don't think I tried to say anything like that.
Okay.
I noticed Eddie O'Brien had his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry to be having the questions when some people haven't asked one yet, but just to say that the book Uncommon Collaboration, I think for anybody who hasn't read it, I found it really excellent, David's book. There is a second book, it's that, and that's a weekend of dialogue with David Bohm called Unfolding Meaning. And I just want to briefly, in the acknowledgements, David was insistent with Don Factor that this would be mentioned. So what David says is, David Bohm wishes to acknowledge the immense value of earlier discussions with J. Krishnamurti and with Dr. Patrick Demare, because a lot of people wouldn't have heard about Demare. But Demare had I think they had very creative times together, David and Demare, and I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, right, yeah, good point.
And just to say, Demare had been involved in dialogue in the form that he was developing for about 40 years when he met David.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization between the two people, the two men.
Yes, agreed. That's my understanding. I don't know about that in detail, but I believe that is the case. That coincides with what I've heard.
Yeah, thank you.
Somebody should correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly, Demare was some kind of psychotherapist or psychiatrist, and I think he developed some form of group therapy, which was one of the contributing things that kind of a stream of things, and that was one element in the stream that led to Bohm dialogue.
Yeah, I was a very close friend of Patrick's. You see, Patrick's, for those, it's mentioned in David Peat's book, he was David's psychiatrist when it was believed he was suffering some depression. And it was when they came together in that regard that then these extraordinary conversations occurred between the two men, which just goes to show there's a value in everything, even depression.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Eddie, for your contribution. I can see Alan has a question for you, David.
Yes, thank you. A brilliant talk. Thank you very much indeed. Tremendous.
Thank you.
Just a sort of quick question. Did David Bohm talk about how to prepare for dialogue? Because in my experience, sort of getting people together when they're suitably prepared and in the right sort of condition, as it were, can make a huge difference. And I'm just wondering if anything was said about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, you know, it's part of the principle of the dialogue that Bohm said there's no fixed purpose. It's related to the fact that you have no agenda and you have no fixed purpose. And, you know, that leads to the question, well, what causes the people to come together and sit around in a circle and start talking? What do they have in mind if they have no fixed purpose? There's no agenda. What precipitates that? And Bohm said that what precipitates it is simply the totality of one's understanding of the whole situation that we are all caught in as members of the human race. It's the awareness that we live in a society which has so much fragmentation and conflict, and the understanding that the conflicts arise because of our different assumptions and all the things that's why dialogue is a complete and natural extension of the whole of Bohmian psychology. The only real preparation for it is to understand Bohmian psychology and everything that he said about the function of assumptions and the role of implicit thought entering into perception. And Bohm says that if you're aware of that, then the awareness of that will lead you to want to engage in this process. So it's not like you have a fixed purpose, you just have a sense of an awareness of a problem, and you can see that an activity like what he has described could be a remedy for that.
That's brilliant, thank you. I've heard the idea that if you're giving attention, knowledge arises, and it seems to be what you said in that area. But
yeah,
everybody has the same sort of, if everybody's paying attention, understanding the problem, then things happen. That's lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I believe Glenn Perry has a question for you. And it's a pleasure to meet you, Glenn.
Pleasure to meet you. First of all, David, thank you so much. I was just blown away by your presentation and especially by your demeanor, the way that you've just taken all this in and it's just coming from your soul, and it's just very beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And there was only one thing that came up that butted against an assumption I hold, so I wanted to share. Then and that was, and again, maybe it's something I misheard, but it felt at one point where someone asked a question about the origin of thought, that maybe you were saying that thought had a physical origin in the brain. Did you in fact say that? And then if that's true, then I just wanted to ask you, do you feel that we are primarily the generators of our thoughts or the receivers?
I'm not sure I know how to answer the last part, but let's come back to the earlier part of your question. And again, I'm trying to speak on behalf of Bohm and what I understand him to have been saying. He said some interesting things about this. He said that we don't understand thought fully. And he said we don't really understand what is the origin of thought. He said the origin of thought, lies deep. It lies in the implicate order, okay? It lies in some very, very subtle territory that is not fully understood. He said that, he said there's another model of the self other than the model that we have. The idea that we have of the self is something static, it's something fixed, it's an image. And he says there's another model, which is that what you actually are is something that emerges. It's a creative process, and it's something which emerges moment to moment. And you can't exactly say where it comes from. It comes from everything. It comes from the totality of all that exists and flows and creates something creatively.
That's beautiful. That's what I thought you probably felt in the deepest level. So thank you so much for everything. What a fantastic presentation. Thank you, David.
Good. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Just because we're entering overtime now, are you okay, David, taking one more question?
Okay, let's take one more.
Okay, I believe Ali's had her hand up for a while. Is that right? Let me just, there we go.
Thank you so much, David, for bringing forward some of the magic and mystery from the implicate order that, after watching the film and hearing the personal story of David Bohm, most particularly relative to this experience of the personal self that he grew up with, right? That was so well done in the movie. And I have simply a request for this idea that what is emerging now, and I want to acknowledge the Pari Center for bringing these people together, of the opportunity to move through the imperfections of how we've begun to feel into what isn't yet known, and to rest in this quality that Bohmian dialogue offers us. I've been a long-term practitioner. I was trained at the Putney Center and have used it a lot in my work. And I want to invite this emergence that you're bringing in relative to the practice that actually can dispel illusion. You spoke so clearly about the distinction of where thought lives in some of these more conventional ways. And then you really invited a very aesthetic new opening. And your humility about that, I just want to honor, because the delicacy of this moment of the portal opening is so wonderful to feel. And so I just wanted to offer a felt sense response into the field so that we might savor this echoing of the potential from your beautiful presentation, and just to put the mirror up that it's very productive and useful, and just, you know, heart full of gratitude.
Okay, good. That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know we said we would only take one more, but I noticed that Peter Hardwick had his hand up a couple of times, and so maybe we can take his question too.
Yes, of course.
Yes, David, of all the different books you've recommended or you've quoted from, which one do you recommend if I want to get an understanding of David Bohm's idea of thinking, and also Krishnamurti? You mentioned a book called Thought as a System by David. Would that be the one that I should start with?
Yeah, that's a very good book. It's this is the transcript of the 1990, the last dialogue that he did at Oak Grove School. And so it's not a book the way people would write a book, it's a transcript of the seminar. And so it includes not only Bohm's presentation, but also the questions that people asked. And so it does not read exactly the same way as an ordinary book would read. When I knew Bohm, I used to ask him, why doesn't he write a book, a proper book to express all his views in the psychological field? And he was, he never really answered me very directly. He was kind of vague about that, but the impression I got was that he felt like his understanding was not finished. He didn't feel like he had a sufficient understanding to really write the proper book. But this book, Thought as a System, does prevent, you know, his a pretty complete, I would say out of all the seminars, we had 5 or 6 seminars that were conducted and transcribed. And I would say the book Thought as a System contains maybe half, roughly, of his views in the psychological field. And so, yeah, that would be the best one.
Just one other quick comment. I've been following some of the retreats with the Buddhist teacher, Alan Wallace, who is giving very, very profound, deep exposition, quotations from teachings from some of the really great lamas going back several hundreds of years. And I do realize they have extremely profound insight into some of the mental processes but particularly the exercises that they give you, which are very, very self-reflective, which I assume you're probably aware of to some degree, great degree probably. Thank you.
Okay, no, I don't know very much about that, but that's good. Thank you for sharing that.
And thank you anyway for your wonderful exposition. Really wonderful, wonderful. You've lightened up my Saturday evening.
Oh, thank you, Peter. I do need to close the session very soon, just because we're over time, and I know we've got people want to ask questions, but fortunately to close. David, would you like to just say something to close?
Wow, I don't have anything prepared. I can't think of anything in particular. You know, there's more to this territory of Bohmian psychology than I had a chance to express. I just gave you really a quick taste of it. It's very, very interesting, very deep, and the way Bohm expresses it is always so interesting. You know, he just had that extraordinary lucid mind, and it's like everything he touched turned to gold at an intellectual level. So I encourage people to look further into this territory.
Great. Well, thank you so much David, for your amazing presentation, and thank you so much for being part of our series. And thank you all for joining us as well, all the participants, and thank you for keep coming back. It's really making this series really great. Now, before I go, I would just like to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I would like to invite you all to tomorrow's session with philosopher Pavel Pleskanin. He will talk about understanding quantum reality and consciousness. I will just put the link so you can learn a bit more about that. There we go. And I would also like to invite you to next week's sessions with Lee, Nicole, and Beth Macy, who's here with us. Both sessions will be talking about mainly around the same theme, which is Bohm and dialogue. Now, given these two sessions, we have decided to send you the PDF of the latest issue of the Pari Center Journal, the Pari Perspective, which is already available to our members. This issue focuses on communication, and it has several articles on dialogue. So I invite you all to read the journal, in particular these essays on dialogue, so we can enter next week's sessions with sort of a common ground. Also would like to announce here that after much request, we have now a free discussion platform called Sutra. With this forum, we will be able to keep the discussions going from these sessions, explore related topics, ask questions, and clarify some points made maybe in the presentations. And in this forum, we will have participants and speakers so we can all communicate together. Now, most of you will have received the invitation to join, but if you haven't received an invitation yet, please let us know by contacting us. To contact us, whether it's about Sutra or any other queries, you can visit our website. We've got a contact us section, or just send us an email with these email addresses. I'll just put them in the comment section as well. One of them is for myself, and the other one is for Eleanor. And I believe that is all. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, James.
Bye, Manfred.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, James. Wonderful. Thank you.
I'm glad to meet you, Glenn.
Oh, very good to meet you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. It was beautiful. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Bye, Glenn. Take care.
Thank you very much. Auf Wiedersehen from Germany.
Bye,
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.